Hello and welcome to the election corner on One Man Think Tank. Remember how I had a thumbnail last week that showed like Mitch McConnell being surfed up in a giant blue wave, and I said "surfs up," and I expressed in the video how didn't think how it could get worse for Republicans. It's gotten worse, so much worse. As you can see, as I always do, I put in the safe seats. Now for this, we need to be really clear about what I mean by safe seat. A safe seat is a seat I inherently see as uncompetitive. The challenger has no. Well, not necessarily. The non incumbent party has no chance of winning it. Or if there's no incumbent, whoever's in the lead has far and away a victory. So all of the states you see on the board are non competitive states as far as I'm concerned. The challenger has no chance of winning them. They are doing incredibly poorly and would require a frankly, miracle or fluke in voter turnout in order to win. The two states which are likely, emphasis on two states if you watched my videos before, are likely because it involves an incumbent losing. For the sake of recording these videos, you'll have to forgive me, my throat's a little bit dry. For the sake of recording these videos, the incumbent is basically has no chance of victory, but because there is an incumbent who's losing, I do move the seats into a likely column. But for a video where I'm trying to explain to you the various seats and why they're flipping, it doesn't make sense to argue seats I see as unwinnable. So, to clarify, three seats which others may see as competitive that I don't are Arizona, Colorado, and Michigan. Especially after it turns out Challenger John James might be linked to the guys who tried to kidnap the governor. Whoops! Yeah, that's great. But for keen-eyed observers, you might notice there are two seats which used to be safe that aren't anymore. They're Mississippi and Alabama. It's gone worse for the Republicans. These two seats are now competitive. And to show this, we'll start doing our likely seats. So first off, we'll knock off the two likely Democratic seats, North Carolina, and Maine. These two seats are most likely going to flip. However, the two Republican incumbents remain competitive. However, they are having a tough time in the polls and only poll well when their Democratic opponent is polling very poorly, usually with a high number of undecideds. New York Times! But once you eliminate undecideds, the Democrat far and away has victory, and they have polled incredibly well for an incredibly long time, as well as the incumbents having very low favorability ratings. So for now, these are likely, and as you can see, the Democrats, should they win the presidency, will take control of the Senate. But there are so many seats that haven't been decided yet, so let's do a few more likely seats, including Mississippi and Alabama. This is why I made the clarification on why these two likely seats were counted as safe before. For those of you who have watched my videos before, you know Alabama and Mississippi were in the safe category up until today. The reason these have both been moved into hard likelies is due to the fact the races have basically overnight gone from being uncompetitive by all metrics on my accounts to being competitive for two separate reasons. For Mississippi, it's due to the fact the challenging Democrat, Mike Espy, received a couple million, like we're talking 7 figures, to try and win this seat. Mississippi is one of the best states to run in if you don't have a lot of cash, because a small amount of money goes a long way. And when he has 3 times the figures as his Republican opponent, I believe, that is not a number you should quote anywhere. I am literally pulling this from the deepest parts of my memory, and that could very well be a different state or the wrong numbers. But it sounds right. When he's running with that much cash, and did have a poll, it wasn't internal, where he is only 1 point behind his opponent, I have to consider the race competitive. If he pours money in and can win undecided voters, this race is competitive. Especially when we haven't seen polling from his from the incumbent senator can't remember her name right now, the incumbent senator, is not polling, well, she's not polling above 50. You need to poll above 50 if I'm going to start ignoring your opponent having a lot of money. Looking at you, Kentucky. The other state is Alabama, where we just got an internal from the Doug Jones campaign, which showed him ahead. Now, you should not base your entire election prediction off of one campaign internal. One poll? Okay, then we're talking, okay, this is a little bit more competitive. However, campaign internals are still polls. They are biased towards whichever campaign is putting them out, but they are still polls. And if you have a campaign internal that shows you ahead, you release it. That's rule of thumb. And the fact Doug Jones was able to produce a campaign internal from a reputable pollster, which showed him 1 point ahead at high 40s for both of them, is enough for me to go, okay, this race is competitive. Still likely Republican. Doug Jones probably going to lose. But that's a bad number for the Republican Party. The fact that this late in the campaign, all of a sudden the Democrat can pull out a campaign internal saying, hey, look, I'm competitive here. What should be happening in these last 2 weeks is we should see numbers narrowing and us being a little bit, being more confident in making certain polling calls. But the fact that more races are becoming competitive than less is a really bad sign for the Republican Party, because they are all against the Republicans. And speaking of that, let's knock off our lean states, because it only gets worse for Republicans from here. Because we only have 2 lean states. Texas, which is leans Republican, and Democratic now Iowa, which leans Democratic. Joni Ernst in Iowa is polling abysmally. She just had a major gaffe in the only debate where she did not know. She got the price of soybeans at half of what it should be, which in Iowa there are 4 major crops that are put out. The top 2 are corn and soybeans, and her opponent nailed corn. And like I've said before, she's somehow functioning as a stand-in for the very unpopular female Republican governor. I'm not going to look too much deeper into that, about why it's only extending to the Senate race more so than the presidential. But it is hurting her quite a bit in the Senate race, and for that reason it leans Democratic. While Texas, and this is going to be important, because, you know, I keep saying watch this seat, watch it harder. Texas is having stupendously high voter turnout. I released a video 2 days ago talking about how the early voting is off the charts for the for across the board, but especially in competitive seats. At that time, Texas had been going for 1 day and had put out 17% of their 2016 vote. So, if in a competitive Texas, like if we're talking 2018, that's an even higher percentage. And the votes are heavily biased towards the Democrats right now. Like 2/3 to 1/3, Democratic to Republican, assuming independents are splitting evenly too. And in Texas, we have some proof that independents break a little bit more towards the Democrats in this election, so could be even higher. But more importantly, today, Texas is at almost 40%. 40% turnout of their 2016 turnout. By election day, they could very well be at 60% or higher. And we still have 2 weeks. Texas has been early voting for 3 days. I'll throw out the usual caveats, but I'm beginning to believe them less and less myself. That, well, Republican turnout will start to increase as we get closer to election day, which I believe will happen. But I'm starting to believe less and less that Democratic turnout's going to really start to drop before election day. And based on history, there's another spike on election day, even with coronavirus. This could be really bad news for Republicans, both for the presidential and Senate races in Texas. For right now, it leans Republican. We're not seeing polls showing Hagar overtaking Cornyn, but Cornyn's also only polling high 40s, while Hagar has gone up from 30s, low 40s to low 40s, mid 40s. That's a spike for her. She's starting to gain on him. And that means the race is competitive, and in a high turnout election, we're looking at a blue Texas. So everything else that you see on this board is what we will consider a toss-up. I don't personally leave a state as a toss-up. I believe it can tilt one way or another. Sometimes it's a leans and it's a kind of weird overlap, but overall tilt. And as you can see, there are 7 races on the board. Sorry, 6 races on the board. Alaska, Montana, Kansas, the 2 Georgias, and South Carolina. All of these seats are in Republican hands. And for them all to be toss-ups is not good, especially when we're looking at what could be a very high turnout election. There are some polling numbers indicating it could be the highest turnout election since 1908. That's bad for the Republicans, because they suffer from the problem of having a lot of ceilings in states, while the Democrats don't. They suffer from turnout problems in states. So let's go state by state, and I'm going to let you know these are all, they could be down to 51% of the time the party wins here. So don't be going, oh, well, this is a clear definite that 100% of the time someone's going to win. No. If I say a state is tilt Republican, that means the Democrats could win 49% of the time, and vice versa. But I want to give you the best information, and leaving them as toss-ups is, in my opinion, a little bit of a sort of gamey thing to do. So let's start with Alaska, which is tilt Republican. Last time it was leans, now it's tilt. Alaska has become more competitive, especially as we get some polling out of the state, which continues to show the point of the incumbent senator, high 40s, but not getting into the 50s, which is where he should be. And his opponent is also in the high 40s. And they are now neck and neck with each other, and Alaska is a notoriously hard state to poll. North Carolina, Alaska, North Dakota, and Nevada are probably 3 of the hardest states to poll out of the bunch. To give you an idea, that New York Times Siena poll that came out, I think it had a very low number of respondents, and it resulted in it making it look like the third-party candidate was going to gain 10% of the vote, which I think is unlikely. But it did show that overall the Republican candidate has low favorables, is polling high 40s, which is good. It leaves the state Republican, but he shouldn't be at high 40s in Alaska. Well, his opponent's also at the high 40s, and it keeps switching between each other, and especially when the presidential race is so much more split to the point it's safe for the Republican Donald Trump. This is a bad sign for Republicans in Alaska. So Alaska, tilt Republican. Montana is also tilt Republican. I'm warming up to the idea of moving it back to the Democratic column, but I'm going to need to see some higher early voting turnout in Montana before that happens, and a few more polls. For quite a while, it looked like the Republican candidate, Steve Daines, polling above 50%, and the challenger, soon-to-be former Governor Steve Bullock, is only polling mid-40s. He's held that consistently. Well, in the last few days, Steve Bullock has seen a spike going up into the high 40s, and Steve Daines is seeing a slight decrease, going from consistently high 50s to now, not high 50s, low 50s, to now low 50s, high 40s, which is not a drop you want to be seeing in a lead-up to Election Day. It could be argued the race is narrowing, but in a narrowing race, typically it's just undecideds breaking towards one side, and the overall margin between the two candidates decreases while the leader doesn't lose support, whoever's in the lead. So this is a bad sign for Steve Daines. In Kansas, another tilt Republican, going from leans to tilt. We need more polling out of Kansas. But we don't have any, so we have to go with what we've got, and that is 2 leaked internals, one released internal from the Democratic campaign, and one leaked one from the Republican campaign, showing the Democratic candidate ahead with a lot of undecided voters. And what we're learning from Kansas is high turnout equals Democratic victory. and a state that could potentially be seeing a slight change in its makeup. For now, I'm going off of some old polling data. The fact no new internals have been released, that's pretty damning to both sides. But it means no one's releasing any polls because no one's confident in what's happening in the state. And also, Kansas has a low overall turnout right now for early ballots, but I'm pretty sure they restricted it slightly. But also, Kansas has gotten a lot more competitive, so for right now, it's tilt. Once we get some more polling, or we actually have proper releases of the early voting data, then I might move it back to a more solid Republican standpoint, but for now, looking very competitive. Now for the controversial calls: Georgia, South Carolina, and Georgia's special election. These three races are probably some of the three most damning for Republicans, especially if the Democrats do well here. Because already, not only are they competitive, these three states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, are general election flippers for the presidency. If the Democrats begin regaining the Deep South, Lyndon B. Johnson famously said when he signed the Civil Rights Act, "We've lost the South for a generation." Seems like we're past a generation and they're starting to go back to the Democratic way of thinking. And those are bad numbers. Those are 3 Senate seats, over 24 electoral college votes. Sorry, not 3 Senate seats. I don't know why I said that. 6 Senate seats between the lot of them. And the more blue the South goes, the more it's going to spread to neighboring states, especially when the Democrats are already winning the West Coast, the Northeast. Looks like they're solidifying in the Great Lakes again. Southwest, potentially Texas. If they keep expanding into the Deep South, the Republicans are going to basically be left with the Plains and Appalachia, and that's it. So how are these states going? Well, after taking a good, hard look at Georgia for both of the elections, they're tilt Democratic. The Democratic candidates are spiking in those states, and I mean spiking. They are gathering support incredibly quickly and are looking like they are in the potential position to have a high turnout election this year, which will flip the state. Especially in the Senate election, where people seem to be really turning on the 2 incumbents. And that's bad news for the Republicans. Like I said, 51% of the time, but 51% of the time, now the Democrats have 53 seats. The reason why that's important is the more seats Democrats use to run up the score, especially in a state like Georgia, where the candidates are unabashedly running as liberal, so you don't have a Joe Manchin situation where they have to go, well, I can't vote on this abortion legislation. They can go, well, no, I said I was pro-abortion, I can vote on this bill. And it only gains for them. So, like, tilt elections in a high turnout election historically favor the Democrats. Look back at 2008. Democrats won some seats they should not have won. But we need to talk about South Carolina. South Carolina is so close, I genuinely kind of want to leave it as a toss-up, but that's not how I do things. Looking at the polls, looking at the numbers, reviewing it, seeing the high early voter turnout, seeing Jamie Harrison gaining in the polls, seeing him only polling low when there's a lot of undecided voters. And the undecided voters are mostly black and young. I'm going to make a controversial call and say South Carolina for this week. This week, October 17th to October 23rd, is tilt Democratic. 54 to the Democrats, 46 to the Republicans, with a potential for the Democrats, with a minimum floor for the Democrats now to have 51 seats, a high level of the Democrats walking away with 57. 58 even, if Texas keeps these high turnout numbers. So with that all being said, if you liked the video, drop a like down below. Also, leave a comment. I am curious to hear your guys' opinion, especially about my call for South Carolina. If you want to see more from me outside of YouTube, I do have a Twitter at OneManThinkTan1, the Roman numeral, link in the description. And if you want to see more content from the channel, click the subscribe button and the notification bell to be alerted when new content comes out. Otherwise, as always, have a wonderful day.